Back here. Or maybe you'd work harder. God damn it, it's not that I'm just a lazy person. Everybody told me I didn't try hard in school and I feel like a failure. I've got a condition called ADHD. Maybe I need medicine. I'll really work hard in treatment. It can go both ways, can't it? The label could be an excuse. This is what the editorials say. Mental illness is just an excuse for social deviance. Or it could be empowering if I really do have a disorder. Like with bipolar disorder. It really is a disorder. So it goes both ways. So I told you to stay awake for this. Number 6, harmful dysfunction. Now we could spend a whole lecture on this, but we've got about 3 minutes. Jerry Wakefield was a math major here at UC Berkeley. Got his master's in philosophy, worked with John Searle, was about to do his dissertation, and then said, philosophy is kind of abstract. I really want to help people. He went to school social welfare and got a PhD in social welfare. So he's math guy, philosophy guy, social welfare guy, and he's been an interesting critic of what mental illness is for about 25 years. So 20 years ago, he published 2 really big papers, and he said, we've got it all wrong. We don't have it really all wrong, but we haven't put it together to define mental illness. So here's what Wakefield's model is. It's called harmful dysfunction. He said, first, if we're talking about mental illness, you have to go back to definition number 2. You have to go to the social norm model. We're talking about behaviors, not blood pressure. It can't be a mental illness unless the behaviors are not normative socially, and then go to definition 4, and if they are impairing. So mental illness requires harm. It requires socially deviant behaviors that yield impairment. But he said if we stop there, we're just at the level of sociology and anthropology. So we'll call people with different religions mentally ill. We'll call people who don't behave the same way we do as psychopathological. He said that can't be a good definition of mental illness because then that will engender political repression. So you've got to have harm. You've got to have socially non-normative behavior that yields impairment. So that's definitions 2 and 4. But you also have to have dysfunction. This is an evolutionary view. So he said it's pretty easy with vision. Why did species develop eyes and optic nerves and occipital lobes? Because unless you can perceive with some accuracy the environment, it's hard to get around and move and survive and find prey. We can say if you are blind, there is a dysfunction in the visual system that the natural selection process evolved to help you do this function of seeing. So he said it should be the same way with mental illness, but we're a few decades behind. If I am convinced that my thoughts to you now are being transmitted through this microphone, but they're actually being transmitted from a radio receiver that's implanted in my skull, and I'm receiving signals from Jupiter, you'd start to think, Professor Hinshaw, I don't know about him. This sounds a little deviant. This sounds so deviant. It's not just a political belief, not just a religious minority view. He's got some problems with his thinking. So Wakefield says psychotic thinking is a dysfunction, not in your vision system, but in your rational thinking system. We don't think as rationally as a species as we think we do, but we think rationally enough to have survived. And if I really truly believe that my messages to you emanate from a radio transmitter in my head, then you could probably eventually do a brain scan and say, there's some problems with his rational thinking frontal lobes to parietal lobes, some pathway in the brain. And that would prove, A, by telling you that my transmissions are being transmitted actually from Jupiter, that's probably harmful to me as a professor and you as students, but it's also a dysfunction in my rational thinking process. So if you put those 2 together, that's a mental illness according to Wakefield. Harm, social deviance, and impairment is one part. It's necessary but not sufficient. Dysfunction is necessary. We've got to figure out what's going wrong mentally, but it's not sufficient either. Wakefield gives an interesting example. There's a few people, very rarely, who are born and they come out of the womb and the doctors inspect them and they have 6 toes. What's the medical label for that? There's no label. Who cares? You probably have slightly better balance on the diving board. That's a dysfunction, but it causes no harm, so it's not a condition. So you need both the harm and the dysfunction, harmful dysfunction. It's a bold attempt by Wakefield to put together the social deviance and impairment models with the evolutionary and medical models. Question? Somebody had their hand up, I think. Yes. Well, yeah, I mean, if you just have kind of an unusual idea, what do they say? Well, first it's branded as ridiculous, and then it's revolutionary, and then it's like part of the accepted thing, and everybody thought that all the time. So, right? This is an interesting idea. Question here. The harm part would be if I keep telling you guys, as my students that, and my colleagues that, I'm going to lose my job. They're going to say I'm crazy. And, quote, maybe I am. So it's probably harmful to have really irrational belief, but that harm isn't enough, because if I tell you my strange religious beliefs, that might cause harm too, but it's not a dysfunction. Got it? But it wouldn't be dysfunction. It would be harmful as heck if I lived in an intolerant society. But it's just a belief. My brain is functioning in a rational way. It's just that I have a different belief. If it's really a dysfunction that's causing major problems in thinking, we should be able to biologically pick it up. That's the difference. Make sense? Okay, what's the 7th? I'm sorry. What's the 7th model? This is what we're talking about in this class. Developmental psychopathology. Normal, atypical. Transactional pathways. Equifinality, multifinality. Reciprocal change. Mental illness isn't a thing, a box. It's not a medical condition. It's not socially or morally deviant. It's not just statistically abnormal. It's not just impairment. It's a developmental process by which, for complex reasons, a subgroup of people, emotionally, achievement-wise, learning-wise, behaviorally, start to deviate from a path that's healthy. The developmental psychopathology model is probably the most accurate, but it's really complicated, as you'll find out from reading the chapters and taking this course. It's not as simple as those first 6. It's transactional. It's nonlinear. You can't know it unless you study people over time. So there's no newspaper headline. There's no bullet point that says, the developmental psychopathology model. That's pretty simple. That's what abnormal behaviors. That's what mental illness is. It's complicated. It might get simpler as we know more, but it may be the most accurate. So, in fact, in this course, we will, with various conditions we talk about statistical and normative and moral and harmful dysfunction, impairment, medical models, but we'll try to frame them, most of all, in the developmental psychopathology framework, which is far from simple. So, we're going to go on to a couple of other points. Questions first. If you look at these notes and if you read the chapter, this will start to come together. This is foundational. A lot of you are going to go on in psychology in some ways, working in schools, working as clinicians, some as researchers, some are going to go into business, some are going to do other stuff altogether, but you're going to have yourselves or your family members or your kids or your friends suffering. And you might ask yourself, as you think about it, what model am I invoking? How moral am I about this? Is it just deviance? Do I believe in harmful dysfunction? What is the developmental psychopathology model? I think it might help. Question? The DSM-5 played it smart and said, you know what, Wakefield's a pretty cool guy. We believe in him, but we don't know how to define it perfectly yet. So the DSM-5 authors say, a developmental psychopathology and harmful dysfunction model probably ultimately is a cause, but our brain scans aren't sensitive enough yet. And we don't know how to integrate evolution with culture yet. So the DSM-5 people, they're no dummies, but we don't have a manual in the developmental psychopathology perspective yet. We're too far from it. Now, what's next? This is related to the first model, the statistical model. Is the stuff we're talking about in this course part of a category or a continuum? This was the continuity-discontinuity point number 2 I made in the last lecture. Is autism a category, or are all of us a little bit to a more moderate bit to a lot bit autistic, and it's just like blood pressure? Do all of us have a little bit of ADHD, and some of us actually more? Are all of us, very few people, who've never been depressed a day in their life? And in fact, if you're in that group, watch out for bipolar disorder, because you might be manic, right? Is depression a category, or is it just the end of a continuum? This is a fundamental question. And the best answers are that the more we look at it statistically, what we used to think autism used to be a category, you had autism or not. If you look at people over time, and if you look at their family members, it's a spectrum. Same with bipolar disorder. It used to be thought, you've got manic depression or you don't. But then there's bipolar type 2, and there's cyclothymia, and there's intermediate stages. And in fact, there's not much evidence that anything we'll talk about in this course is truly a separate category. Kind of raises interesting points about stigma, doesn't it? We all have a little bit of potential for mental illness in us. What are the triggers that might make at some point in our development those latent tendencies emerge? We're probably all on a continuum, but again, the DSM says you've either got the disorder or you don't. So there's tension in the field about this. So Jerry Kagan, developmental psychologist at Harvard, says, slow down a minute. There's about 15% of infants, and you can measure them between 0 months and 12 months, and we'll talk about temperament very shortly in this course. And they're the kind of infants who do what? They're hanging out in the crib the way infants do, unless they're crawling around. And what do the relatives do? They come over and like, try to make the kid laugh and smile, and a lot of kids smile back. And there's a subset of infants who freak out. Get out of my face, Uncle Joe. I don't like this. And if you measure them, they're secreting cortisol and they're panicked. So Kagan calls this inhibited temperament. And there's a difference, he says. There's about 15% of infants who really are in a separate category. They're really inhibited. They don't like that social stimulation. Is that true? Or is it just, well, maybe they're just a notch more inhibited than the rest? It continues to be a debate. Separate category or part of a continuum? Depression is very continuous, but there's something called melancholia. This is an old Greek term. It's been around for centuries. And today, melancholia refers to a subtype of people with depression. These are people who tend to wake up at 3:38 a.m. by their digital clock, and they're awake and they're not going back to sleep, terrified, and feel almost like a zombie until noon or 1, and then somehow in the afternoon, the suicidal despair lifts for a few hours, and then it comes back that next night. And they tend to have family members with very severe depression. So this is called melancholic depression. As you might guess, this is more heritable. There's more genetic basis. It seems to be almost a separate category of depression for most people who have severe depressions. So maybe within the continua, the bell curve, if I show that slide again, there are actually separate clusters of people with really separate conditions. Now, is this true in intellectual disability? A lot of people have IQs below 70. They're in the mentally retarded or intellectually disabled range. But some of them, especially those with very low IQs, actually have a chromosome that's been tinkered with during meiosis or have a genetic abnormality. They're in a separate category. So there may be categories hidden within the continua. What's a taxon? A taxon's a category. You'll see that word in some of the chapters. So is it taxonomic or is it continuous? Same thing as is it categorical or is it continuous? Taxometrics is a fancy branch of statistics that, without even knowing if they're separate genes or causes, we're trying to figure out, is there really a hidden category of taxon within the continua? Okay, last big point today. This is historical, but it's still relevant. We're going to talk about kids in this course who are suffering or are making their parents and teachers and siblings suffer. How do we categorize it? Do we just list all the millions of problems they could have, or is there some underlying scheme here? So, if you've taken Psych 150 personality psych, this will be familiar. How do we categorize people's personality traits? So, Tom Achenbach, professor at University of Vermont, trained as an epidemiologist in public health, and then got a degree in psychology, 45 years ago said, we got to figure out what the patterns are. So he looked at every rating scale and checklist and study ever done of kids with problems and got hundreds of items. Gouges other children in the face, wets pants, seems overly shy. All these hundreds of descriptions, and he did statistics. So one kind of statistic is called a factor analysis. Is there some underlying thing or factor or dimension that might explain statistically the variation across a lot of those very specific symptoms? So this is what the people did. The people who invented the big 5, they started with 600 or 700 items of your personality, factor analysis, and they came down to 15, 10, and then 5 big factors, ocean, if you know what I'm talking about with that. So similarly, Achenbach said, there's really 8 fundamental types of child misbehavior or problematic behavior. There's a bunch of symptoms that relate to kids who are very socially withdrawn from others. They are either too freaked out or don't have the skills to interact. There's a lot of other symptoms, stomach aches, headaches, body aches. Doctors can't find any cause, but a lot of kids seem to have bodily concerns. They're overly sensitive to physical symptoms inside themselves, but we really can't find any ulcer or any other cause. Third category, kind of makes sense, there's a lot of kids who tend to be either very sad or very anxious or both together. The fourth cluster of symptoms, not just withdrawal, but annoying, pestering, not having good social skills of others, kids who really don't do well with their peer group. A rare but important fifth category is kids who think deviantly, maybe a few who believe the radio transmitters implanted in their head, or they have very strange, magical, or paranoid beliefs. The sixth one is, it's called attention problems, but it's attentional problems and impulse control problems and often being too active, the sort of ADHD-like factor. A very important one was number 7, kids who just don't follow the rules, and not because they're making a political choice necessarily, but because they can't regulate themselves. And they annoy parents and they swear at preschool teachers and wreak havoc. And then the 8th is, kind of an extension of that, kids who are very aggressive and have been so often for a long time. Now what happens if you take those 8 and you do more statistics and you try to see, are those 8 it, or is there something even more fundamental? If you take those 8, the social withdrawal, the somatic concerns, and the anxiety and depression factors kind of make a supercluster, or a superfactor, that Achenbach called internalizing. Now this is a very psychodynamic term. I've got a conflict, I've got a problem, but I take it out, I internalize it. And then the last 2, these non-compliant and aggressive behaviors, I've got a problem, I've got a family issue, I've got a conflict, I externalize it, I act it out against the world, externalizing. And interestingly, attention problems, thinking problems, and social problems were right in between. And you can think about some kids with ADHD-like symptoms are very inattentive and kind of shy, and others are Dennis the Menace, they're in your face. And some kids with thinking problems are very shy, and others with extreme thinking problems might turn out to be the next school shooter. So you could go internalizing or externalizing, same thing with social problems. So this is the way many researchers and clinicians still view the playing field. At the one end are kids who are primarily internalizing, withdrawn, sad, anxious, depressed, concerned with their bodies, and at the other end are kids who take it out for whatever reasons against the world. Internalizing problems, and you'll see this in the chapters, are sometimes called overcontrolled or emotional disorders. What's an emotionally disturbed kid? Well, it's a very funny, fuzzy term, but it's a synonym for internalizing. Externalizing might be called under control. I can't restrain my impulses. I've got a behavioral issue or behavior disorder. That's externalizing, emotional internalizing. Kind of a stupid distinction because many kids who act out might have emotional regulation problems too, right? So I'm just telling you the synonyms. They might not make perfect sense. If you go way general, externalizing problems at age 4 and 5 and 6 tend to persist more than internalizing because a lot of kids' fears and phobias tend to go away with time. We'll talk in this course about how different traits in infancy might predict internalizing versus externalizing problems. Boys tend to be externalizers, girls tend to be internalizers, but there's way exceptions to that. That's a stereotype to hold to it. And of course, it's developmental. In adolescence, girls overtake boys, as we'll talk about, in terms of anxiety and depression and eating symptoms and cutting and all that as a function of that phase of life. Overall, pretty hard to treat really aggressive kids, somewhat easier to treat depressed kids, but there's exceptions to that. Now here's the final point. Achenbach said on the one end there's internalizing, the other externalizing, but what happens if you go to a clinic? What if you work at a child guidance center or direct a mental health center and the kid comes in? What's very likely? The kid's sad and shy and aggressive. The girl's having eating problems and impulse control problems. These things are associated. They're not separate. In the real world, even though the factor analysis tells you, way, they're on separate ends of the continuum, kids with a lot of problems tend to have both kinds of problems. So we'll talk about this study in a few weeks when we talk about ADHD. This is a Venn diagram of about 600 kids in America. We did some of the study here at Berkeley. And they had ADHD, but what do they also have? Oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, tic disorders, mood disorders, anxiety disorders. Some of the kids in the study had 7 disorders. This is called comorbidity. So if it's dimensions of internalizing, externalizing, how are they associated? If you've got a disorder, a diagnosis, comorbidity means do you have one disorder and another together? And we'll pick up on that point next time.